Next up, we have my colleague, Bryan Brown. Bryan is a native of Bellevue, Pennsylvania, who completed his master's in library and information science with a specialization in archives and information science from the University of Pittsburgh in 2015. As a project archivist, Bryan processes collections and digitizes items within collections for the Historic Pittsburgh website. Welcome, Bryan. And we're going to take a medical turn now for the rest of the program.
Great. Thank you, Sierra. Hi, everyone. Tonight, I wanted to talk to you about the Shadyside Hospital records and what stories it holds. And here on this slide, we have on the left a group of doctors operating on a patient around 1890 to 1910. And on the right is an image of some nursing school students during their graduation ceremony during the 1970s or the 1980s. Okay. Shadyside Hospital's long history starts in 1866 when three physicians, John C. Berger on the left with a large beard, Marcelin Cote in the middle with a smaller beard and glasses, and Herman H. Hoffman on the right with no beard or glasses, gathering donations to open a hospital dedicated to homeopathic medicine in downtown Pittsburgh. The Pennsylvania legislature granted the charter for the hospital on April 4th, 1866. The Homeopathic Medical and Surgical Hospital and Dispensary of Pittsburgh, thankfully shortened to Homeopathic Hospital, opened its doors on July 26, 1866 at 146 2nd Avenue, now known as Boulevard of the Allies, near the Smithfield Street intersection. The hospital treated people who couldn't afford medical care, as well as patients who paid for a room. This required the hospital to rely on charitable donations to pay for medical supplies, making it a unique case compared to other hospitals in the region. As demand for hospital care grew, so did the need for more staff and space for patients. A new downtown structure very near the 2nd Avenue location opened on April 12, 1884. The top image on this slide is an illustration of that building. Rising admissions and downtown's population growth forced the hospital to look at different neighborhoods for the construction of a new building. The new hospital opened its doors to patients on March 1st, 1910, and was located near the corner of Center and Aiken Avenues in Shadyside. The top right image on this slide is the image of the structure after its completion. The downtown building remained open until 1915. Despite the move to Shadyside, overcrowding still plagued the hospital. The north and south wings were added to the original Shadyside structure in 1926 and 1955, respectively, to add some space. The bottom left image is an aerial view of the hospital after the south wing was completed. The Shadyside Hospital finally reached its current location in 1992 with the demolition of the original main building and being replaced with a new main structure. The bottom right image is an aerial view of the hospital at its current location. In the midst of the moves and building expansions, the hospital officially changed its name to Shadyside Hospital on May 16, 1938, as the hospital wanted to distance itself from homeopathic medical practices. The images on this slide are the meeting minutes for the Board of Trustees that made that name change official. Now that we talked about the history of Shadyside, I want to discuss the types of records within the collection and what stories they tell. The records in this collection are arranged into 8 series and several sub-series under them. The first portion of the collection I want to talk about is the administrative records series. These records relate to the overall operation of the hospital. They include meeting minutes, patient records, records from staff, correspondence, and promotional materials for hospital events. And on this slide, we have an invitation to the cornerstone laying of the original Shadyside structure in 1907. And on the right, we have a patient record book from 1921. And even though that there are patient records within this series, there are only a handful that are restricted due to personal identifiable information. And records that do have that kind of information were received a restriction for 90 years to ensure the privacy for those patients. On this slide, we have a scan of the matron's monthly report for February 1876. This document has patient names, the number of days in the hospital, and why they were admitted. And on the back of this document, it provides data regarding the number of patients that remained after the previous report, admissions, discharges, deaths, births, and the number of patients that remained at the end of this report. Because of all this information regarding the patients, this document is a great resource for understanding who came into the hospital and why in the early years. Here we have a sample of different newsletters within the collection. Throughout its history, Shadyside Hospital had numerous employee newsletters regarding all the previous and upcoming events and achievements. The HHH Record, the Hospital News, and the Voice of Shadyside Hospital were some of the original newsletters in the publicity and publication series. The images on this slide are all the first issues of each newsletter. And also within this series is a considerable number of medical publications by staff and outside organizations, and also a considerable amount of newspaper clippings that highlight the work of Shadyside Hospital and the events they hosted. Throughout Shadyside's history, there have been numerous associations and groups that assisted the hospital to gather funds, finances for expansions, events, and other projects. The collection contains records for the three earliest organizations: the Ladies Association of Shadyside Hospital, the Shadyside Hospital Auxiliary, and the Social Service Board. The image on the left is a page from the Ladies Association's handbook. The middle image is an invitation for the Hospital Auxiliary's Gala Art Auction. And the right image is a letter informing members of the dissolution of the Social Service Board. Today, the Shadyside Hospital Foundation supports the hospital and achieve its goals and provided the funds to process this collection. While there are a plethora of paper records, the largest portion of this collection is by far the photographs and transparency series. This portion of the collection includes images of hospital buildings and facility, can't speak, sorry about that. Staff, patients, and events, and print photographs, negatives, and transparent slides. The photograph series of this collection spans from the earliest days of the hospital to modern times. The image on the top left is a trio of nursing school seniors posing in the operating room in 1921. The image on the bottom left is a group of patients waiting for treatment in the hospital's dispensary in 1930s to 1940s. And the image on the right is a group of doctors and nurses monitoring a patient who is receiving treatment for scoliosis and is in a straightening machine in 1920. And if I have to say, it looks kind of uncomfortable. During my research for this presentation, I wanted to find some records about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic to see how the hospital reacted. One thing that surprised me was how little the hospital discussed it. One reason for this is that the collection unfortunately lacks patient records for those years. Another reason for this is that the executive committee focused on the number of doctors and nurses serving in World War I. At one point, the hospital had nearly 50% of its doctors serving in some capacity. The hospital reached a point of desperation that the executive committee wrote to Army superiors requesting that doctors drafted into service be exempted from serving to come home to Pittsburgh. On this slide are pages of the executive committee meeting minutes describing the status of the hospital departments and copies of letters written to the Army officials and the responses from the Army personnel. These pages of minutes demonstrate the hospital's focus and struggles during this trying period. Although the hospital's focus on World War I was understandable, I wanted to find some materials regarding the 1918 pandemic. I kept searching in different parts of the collection for something and eventually found something. The image on the left is a copy of the minutes from the executive committee creating a policy to create and to increase the number of nurses needed in the hospital to combat the pandemic. And the other two images on this slide are pages from the Women's Homeopathic Medical Society of Pittsburgh meeting minutes that discuss the influenza epidemic and how some doctors reacted. Even though the collection lacks outright records regarding the treatment of patients during the pandemic, I was able to find something. Now that I've talked about some aspects of the collection, I wanted to give a quick plug for Historic Pittsburgh. As some of you may be aware, Historic Pittsburgh is a collaboration between multiple institutions in the Pittsburgh region, hosted by the University of Pittsburgh to house digital copies of materials online. To help researchers find records within the Shadyside Hospital records, there is a finding aid available on the site. Along with the finding aid are 100 images from the collection and are available now. The image on the left of this slide is the collection's homepage that describes what is available online, what other materials are in the collection, and a brief history of Shadyside Hospital. And on the right of the slide is an example of an image's description and metadata. And the images on Historic Pittsburgh are high definition versions that researchers can zoom in and out to focus on specific portions of the image. And here are a couple examples of some images on Historic Pittsburgh. On the left, we have a view of women laying in the hospital beds in the women's ward, circa 1910 to 1925. And on the right, we have a group of doctors playing a game of bridge during their downtime. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope that if this piques your interest, you'll come into the archives to take a look at this fascinating collection.